Hi and welcome to the archive of history. It is late now, somewhere between the last hours of evening and the quiet arrival of night. The world outside your window has begun to settle. The noise and urgency of the day are fading into memory. In this peaceful moment, I invite you to let everything else fall away. Close your eyes if you wish. Let your breathing slow. Tonight we are traveling back through time, not to visit the familiar halls of Rome or the castles of medieval Europe, but to journey much, much further. We are going to the very beginning, to the moment when everything changed. We are going to walk through the first cities ever built, to hear the first written words ever pressed into clay, to stand beneath the shadow of the first great temples that reached toward the heavens. We are traveling to ancient Sumer, to the land between two rivers, where civilization itself was born. Before we drift off, I am always curious to know where my listeners are tuning in from and what time it is that they are listening tonight. Let me know in the comments. Imagine for a moment that it is night in the deep past. The year is impossible to name, because years are not yet numbered in the way we understand them now. You are standing in the warm darkness of southern Mesopotamia, in the flat alluvial plain that lies between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Above you, the sky is vast and brilliant with stars. There are no city lights to dim them, no haze of industry. The constellations blaze with a clarity that no modern eye will ever see again. The air is thick with the smell of river water and wet earth. Somewhere in the distance, you hear the soft lowing of cattle and the rustle of reeds moving in the night breeze. You are surrounded by a landscape that is neither desert nor jungle, but something in between. It is a fertile, marshy plain, rich with life, dangerous with floods, and utterly transformed by the hands of human beings who have chosen, against all logic, to make this difficult place their home. This is not the world of kings and empires yet. This is earlier. This is the world of the first experiment, the first great gamble. Somewhere nearby, beyond the fields of barley and the groves of date palms, there is a city, not a village, not a collection of huts, but a true city. It is a place of walls and gates, of wide streets and towering temples, of thousands upon thousands of people living together in a way that had never been tried before. It is a place where human life has been fundamentally reimagined, and tonight you are going to step inside. Now, let the noise of the modern world fade away. Let go of your thoughts about tomorrow. Breathe deeply, and let yourself slip backward through the centuries. Let the distant past open before you like a doorway. We are going to walk together through the streets of Uruk and Ur. We are going to watch scribes press their reed styluses into wet clay. We are going to climb the great ziggurats and peer into the shadowed chambers where the gods were said to dwell. We are going to witness the birth of writing, the invention of law, the creation of mathematics and astronomy. We are going to see the very first moments of recorded human thought. This is the story of Sumer. This is the story of where we began. And now, settle in. Close your eyes. Let your body relax into stillness. Our journey is about to begin. The land itself seems impossible. It is flat, almost perfectly flat, stretching away in every direction until it meets the distant haze of the horizon. There are no mountains here, no forests, no natural barriers or defenses. The ground beneath your feet is soft, rich, dark alluvial soil, deposited over countless millennia by the two great rivers that define this place. The Tigris and the Euphrates. They are the arteries of life in this otherwise harsh and unforgiving environment. In the spring, when the winter rains fall in the distant mountains of Anatolia and the Zagros, the rivers swell and rise. Sometimes they overflow their banks, sending sheets of muddy water spreading across the plain, drowning fields, sweeping away homes, transforming the landscape into a shallow, dangerous sea. And then as the heat of summer arrives, the waters recede, leaving behind a fresh layer of nutrient-rich silt. This is the paradox of Mesopotamia. It is a place of both devastating floods and life-giving fertility. It is a land that demands constant attention, constant labor, constant vigilance. And yet, it is precisely this challenge that will forge the first great human civilization. You are walking now across this landscape in the early morning light. The sun is just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the fields. The air is cool, but you can already feel the promise of heat. By midday, the temperature will be brutal, the sky a pale, bleached white. But for now, the world is soft and quiet. You pass through groves of date palms, their trunks tall and slender, their fronds rustling in the breeze. Dates are the sweetness of this land, a source of sugar and sustenance that can be dried and stored for months. Nearby, fields of barley ripple in the wind, their golden heads heavy with grain. Barley is the foundation of life here. It is ground into flour for bread. It is fermented into beer, the daily drink of every man, woman, and child. Without barley, none of this would be possible. The rivers are never far away. You can hear the gentle rush of water moving through irrigation channels, the soft splash of a shadow lifting water from a canal. The Tigris and the Euphrates are not gentle rivers. They are unpredictable, sometimes violent, and always demanding. But they are also the reason anyone lives here at all. In a land where rainfall is scarce and unreliable, these rivers bring water from 1,000 miles away. They bring life. And so the people who live here have learned to work with them. They have learned to dig canals, to build dikes and levees, to guide the water where they need it to go. This is not simple work. It requires planning, coordination, and the labor of hundreds, sometimes thousands, of people working together. And this collective effort, this need for organization and cooperation on a scale never before attempted, is one of the seeds from which civilization will grow. As you walk, you begin to notice other signs of human presence. There are paths worn smooth by countless footsteps. There are small shrines by the side of the road, simple altars of mud brick where travelers leave offerings of barley or beer for the gods. There are herds of sheep and goats grazing in the distance, watched over by solitary shepherds. And then, slowly, you begin to see the city. At first it is just a dark smudge on the horizon, a low line of walls rising from the plain. But as you draw closer, the scale of it becomes clear. This is Uruk, the first true city in human history, and it is immense. The walls that surround it are not simple barriers of mud and reeds. They are monumental constructions, towering ramparts of sun-baked brick, wide enough at the top for a chariot to drive along. They stretch for miles, enclosing an area of over 2 square miles. Inside those walls, over 50,000 people live and work. 50,000. To put this in perspective, at the same time, most of the world is still organized into small villages of a few dozen or a few hundred people at most. But here in Sumer, something extraordinary is happening. People are gathering together in numbers that have never been seen before. They are creating a new kind of society, a new way of living. They are inventing the city. You approach the gates now, and you are struck by the sheer ambition of what you are seeing. The gates themselves are massive, reinforced with bronze fittings, flanked by guard towers. There are people streaming in and out, farmers bringing their produce to market, merchants leading donkeys laden with goods, craftsmen carrying tools, priests in white linen robes heading toward the temple precinct. The noise grows as you get closer. You can hear voices calling out, the bleating of animals, the creak of wooden wheels on stone, the rhythmic pounding of hammers from somewhere inside. This is not the quiet, intimate world of a village. This is something entirely new. This is urban life. As you pass through the gates, the world changes. The streets are narrow and winding, lined with buildings of mud brick that rise 2 or 3 stories high. The walls are thick, keeping the interior cool, even as the sun climbs higher. Most of the buildings are houses, simple rectangular structures built around central courtyards. But scattered among them are workshops where potters shape clay on spinning wheels, where weavers work at looms, where metal workers hammer bronze into tools and weapons. The air is filled with the smell of bread baking, of fish drying in the sun, of the sharp tang of beer fermenting in large clay jars. You walk deeper into the city, following the flow of people, and you begin to understand the complexity of what has been created here. This is not just a large village. This is an organized, structured society with layers of specialization and hierarchy. There are people here who do nothing but write. There are people who do nothing but manage the flow of goods in and out of the city. There are people whose entire lives are dedicated to serving the gods in the temples. This is division of labor on a scale that requires coordination, record keeping, and above all, writing. And then, rising above the low rooftops, you see it, the White Temple. It stands atop a massive platform of mud brick, a ziggurat that lifts the sacred space 40 feet above the city streets. The temple itself is small, almost modest, a simple rectangular structure with whitewashed walls that gleam in the sunlight. But its position, elevated above everything else, makes it unmistakable. This is the center of the city, the axis around which everything else revolves. This is the house of the god, the place where heaven and earth meet. You can see the stairs leading up the side of the platform, and you can imagine the priests climbing them in solemn procession, carrying offerings of bread and beer, grain and incense. The temple is not just a place of worship, it is an economic powerhouse. It owns vast tracts of land, employs hundreds of workers, collects rents and taxes, and redistributes wealth according to the will of the priesthood. In Sumer, the sacred and the economic are not separate. They are deeply, inextricably intertwined. You stand in the shadow of the ziggurat, looking up at the white walls, and you feel the weight of what has been accomplished here. This is not just architecture, this is a statement. It is a declaration that human beings can reshape the world, that they can build monuments that will outlast their own brief lives, that they can reach toward the heavens. And all of this has happened here, in this flat, featureless plain, in this place that offers no natural advantages. There is no stone here for building, so they invented the mud brick. There is no wood for construction, so they imported it from distant lands or learned to make do with reeds and clay. There is no metal, so they developed trade networks that stretched hundreds of miles to bring copper from Anatolia and tin from the mountains of Iran. The Sumerians did not inherit a paradise. They created one, through ingenuity, through relentless labor, through cooperation on a scale that had never been attempted before, and in doing so, they changed the course of human history forever. The sun is high now, and the heat is becoming oppressive. You seek shade in one of the narrow alleyways between buildings, pressing yourself against the cool mud brick wall. Around you, life continues. Children run through the streets, laughing and shouting, playing games with sticks and balls. Women carry water jars balanced on their heads, moving with practiced grace. An old man sits in a doorway, repairing a sandal, his hands moving with the ease of long experience. You realize that this place, for all its strangeness, is also deeply human. These are people living their lives, worrying about their families, hoping for a good harvest, gossiping about their neighbors. And yet, they are also participants in something much larger, something that will echo down through the millennia. They are the first city dwellers. They are the pioneers of a new way of being human, and their story, the story of Sumer, is just beginning. To understand how we arrived at this moment, how the first cities came to be, you must step back in time once more. You must imagine this same landscape but thousands of years earlier, when the great experiment was only just beginning. The year is approximately 5000 BCE, and the world is still in the grip of the Neolithic, the New Stone Age. Human beings have only recently discovered agriculture, the ability to plant seeds and harvest crops, to domesticate animals and keep them penned. For hundreds of thousands of years before this, humans lived as hunter-gatherers, moving with the seasons, following the herds, gathering wild plants. But agriculture changed everything. It meant that people could stay in one place. It meant they could produce a surplus, more food than they needed to survive. And surplus is the key to everything that comes after. The first farmers in Mesopotamia did not settle in the river valleys. The rivers were too unpredictable, too prone to catastrophic flooding. Instead, they built their villages in the foothills to the north and east, in places where rainfall was more reliable and the land could be farmed without irrigation. These were small communities, perhaps 50 or 100 people, living in simple houses of mud brick and reeds. They grew wheat and barley, kept sheep and goats, made pottery, and wove cloth. Life was hard, but it was stable. Generations passed, and the villages grew. And then, slowly, some of them began to move south, down into the flat, dangerous, incredibly fertile plain between the rivers. Why would anyone make this choice? The southern plain was hotter, harsher, more challenging in every way. But it offered something that the northern hills could not, almost unlimited potential. The soil was richer. The growing season was longer. If you could control the water, if you could channel the rivers, you could produce harvests on a scale that was impossible anywhere else. And so, the pioneers came. They built their first settlements on low mounds, natural rises in the landscape that offered some protection from floods. They dug the first irrigation ditches, simple channels that guided water from the river to their fields. And they discovered that it worked. The crops grew tall and thick, the harvests were abundant, and the surplus allowed for something new, specialization. In a small village where everyone is barely surviving, everyone must do a little bit of everything. Everyone farms, everyone hunts, everyone weaves and builds. But in a community with surplus, things change. Not everyone needs to work the fields. Some people can become potters, focusing all their skill on making better, more beautiful vessels. Some can become weavers, producing cloth that is finer and more durable. Some can become tool makers, perfecting the art of flaking stone or later casting bronze. And some can become priests, dedicating their lives to understanding the gods, to performing the rituals that ensure the rains come and the floods recede. Specialization leads to trade. A potter makes more jars than his family needs and exchanges them for grain from a farmer, for meat from a herder, for tools from a craftsman. A network of exchange begins to form, not just within a single village, but between villages and then between regions. And this network, this web of economic connections, is another foundation upon which civilization will rise. As the villages grew, they began to merge. Small settlements clustered together, drawn by the need for defense, for trade, for access to water. The spaces between them filled in. Streets emerged, not by design but by the simple fact of people walking the same paths over and over again. Public buildings appeared, granaries to store the surplus, workshops where craftsmen could work together, shrines where the community could worship. And then at some point that is impossible to pinpoint exactly, a threshold was crossed. The settlement was no longer a village. It was something new. It was a city. Uruk was the first, or at least the first that we know of. By 3500 BCE, it had a population in the tens of thousands. It covered an area larger than most modern towns. It had defensive walls, monumental temples, a complex system of canals and water management. It was a hub of trade, drawing goods from across the region and beyond. Merchants came from the mountains of Anatolia bringing wood and metal. Traders came from the Persian Gulf bringing shells and precious stones. The city was not self-sufficient. It could not be. It depended on the countryside for food, on distant lands for resources it lacked. But in return it offered something that no village could: protection, opportunity, and the sheer energy of thousands of people living and working in close proximity. The city was a magnet, pulling people from the surrounding countryside, transforming them from farmers and herders into urban dwellers, into citizens. But the city also created new problems. How do you organize the labor of thousands of people? How do you distribute resources fairly? How do you resolve disputes, enforce rules, maintain order? The old systems, the informal agreements and kinship bonds that governed village life, were no longer sufficient. Something more was needed. And so, the Sumerians invented government. At first, it was probably the priests who held power. The temple was the center of economic life, and the priests who managed it naturally became the managers of the city as well. They organized the digging of canals, the maintenance of dikes, the storage and distribution of grain. They kept track of who owed what to whom, who had worked, how many days, who had contributed how much to the collective effort. And to do this, they needed a system of record keeping. They needed writing. The landscape you walked through earlier, the fields and canals and date groves, all of this was not natural. It was engineered. Every canal had to be planned, dug, and maintained. Every dike had to be built to just the right height, reinforced against erosion, constantly repaired after floods. This was work that required the coordinated effort of hundreds, sometimes thousands of people. It required leadership, organization, and above all, a way to keep track of what had been done, what needed to be done, and who was responsible for doing it. The Sumerians rose to this challenge with characteristic ingenuity. They developed a system of labor organization that was in its own way as revolutionary as the invention of writing itself. They divided the population into work gangs, each responsible for a specific section of canal or a specific field. They appointed overseers to manage these gangs, to ensure that the work was done properly and on time. And they kept meticulous records, pressing marks into clay tablets to document every day of labor, every basket of grain produced, every jar of oil delivered. This was not slavery, not in the sense we usually understand it. Most of the workers were free men and women, farmers and city dwellers who owed a certain number of days of labor to the temple or the state as a form of tax. It was a system of corvée labor, and it was the engine that powered Sumerian civilization. Without it, the canals would have silted up, the fields would have returned to marsh, and the cities would have collapsed back into villages. But with it, the Sumerians were able to transform their harsh environment into one of the most productive agricultural regions in the ancient world. They turned the desert green. They made the rivers their servants, and in doing so, they created the foundation for everything that would follow. The great cities, the monumental temples, the flowering of art and literature and science. You are standing now at the edge of a canal, watching the water flow past. The canal is straight and deep, its banks reinforced with woven reed mats to prevent erosion. The water is brown with silt, but it is life itself. You can see fields stretching out on either side, the barley already waist-high, rippling in the breeze. In the distance, a group of workers is repairing a section of dike that was damaged in the last flood. They are bare-chested in the heat, their skin dark and weathered, their movements practiced and efficient. An overseer stands nearby, watching them, occasionally calling out instructions. He holds a clay tablet in one hand, a reed stylus in the other, marking down the progress of the work. This is civilization in its most basic form. Human beings working together, shaping their environment, creating order out of chaos. And it is here, in the hot sun, beside a muddy canal, that you begin to understand the true achievement of the Sumerians. They did not just build cities. They built a system, a way of organizing human effort on a scale that had never been attempted before. And that system, refined and elaborated over centuries, would become the template for every civilization that followed. The afternoon sun hangs heavy in the sky as you make your way back toward the city, following a well-worn path that runs parallel to one of the main canals. The heat is almost unbearable now, shimmering off the flat earth in waves that distort the distant horizon. You can feel sweat trickling down your back, and you understand why work stops during the hottest hours of the day. Even the animals seek shade, clustering under the palm trees or in the cool darkness of mud brick shelters. As you walk, you think about the scribes you saw earlier, sitting in the shade of the temple precinct, their hands moving over clay tablets with practiced precision. You wonder what they are writing, what knowledge they are preserving, and then you realize you are about to witness something that will change human history forever. You are about to see the invention of writing itself. Let us step back once more, to a time before writing existed. Imagine trying to run a city, trying to manage the complex economy of thousands of people without any way to record information. You need to know how much grain is stored in the temple granaries. You need to know who has paid their taxes and who has not. You need to keep track of land ownership, of contracts and debts, of the days of labor owed by each household. How do you do this without writing? The early Sumerians solved this problem with a remarkably clever system. They used physical tokens. Small clay objects, each shaped differently to represent a specific commodity. A cone for grain, a sphere for oil, a cylinder for an animal. When a farmer delivered his harvest to the temple, the scribe would count out the appropriate number of tokens and seal them inside a clay envelope called a bulla. The outside of the envelope would be marked with the seal of the transaction, a unique stamp pressed into the soft clay. This way there was a permanent record. If there was ever a dispute, the envelope could be broken open and the tokens counted again. But there was a problem with this system. Once the envelope was sealed, you could not see what was inside without breaking it open. And so scribes began to press the tokens into the outside of the envelope before sealing it, leaving an impression that matched the contents. This was the crucial moment. Someone realized that you did not actually need the tokens at all. You could simply press the symbols directly onto a clay tablet, and you would have the same record. This was the birth of proto-writing, sometime around 3400 BCE. The earliest tablets were simple pictographic representations of objects and numbers. A picture of a jar meant oil. A picture of a sheaf of grain meant barley. A circle with a cross meant a sheep. These were not yet words. They were visual shorthand, a way of recording transactions without the need for physical tokens. But writing, once invented, could not remain static. The system evolved rapidly, driven by the need to record more complex information. The pictographs became more abstract, simplified for speed and ease of use. The scribes discovered that by combining symbols, they could represent new concepts. The symbol for mouth combined with the symbol for water could mean drink. The symbol for mouth combined with the symbol for bread could mean eat. And then the truly revolutionary step. They realized that symbols could represent sounds, not just objects. This meant that they could write down names, could record spoken words, could preserve language itself. This was the transition from pictographic writing to true writing, to what we call cuneiform, from the Latin cunus, meaning wedge, for the wedge-shaped marks made by the reed stylus. You are standing now in the courtyard of the tablet house, the adoba, the school where scribes are trained. It is a large building near the temple precinct, with high walls and small windows to keep it cool. Inside, rows of young students sit cross-legged on the floor, each with a lump of soft clay in front of them and a reed stylus in their hand. The stylus is a simple tool, cut from the stem of a reed that grows in the marshes. One end is cut at an angle to create the wedge shape. The scribe presses it into the clay, making marks that will harden as the tablet dries in the sun or is baked in a kiln. The process is painstaking. Each mark must be precise, each line of text carefully spaced. A single mistake can ruin a tablet, requiring the scribe to smooth it out and start over. The teacher walks among the students, a stern figure in a long robe, carrying a cane that he is not afraid to use. Learning to be a scribe is a privilege, but it is also grueling. Students begin their training as young boys, sometimes as young as 7 or 8, and they will study for years before they are considered proficient. They must memorize hundreds of cuneiform signs, must learn to write quickly and accurately, must master the complex grammar and vocabulary of Sumerian. And it is not just practical writing they learn. They study literature, mathematics, astronomy, and law. They copy out long passages from ancient texts, learning by rote the wisdom of previous generations. They practice writing contracts, legal documents, letters and hymns to the gods. By the time they complete their training, they are members of an elite class, the keepers of knowledge, the guardians of civilization's memory. You watch as one of the students carefully presses his stylus into the clay, forming the signs for an inventory of barley. 5 gerv of barley received from the farmer Lugulin, delivered to the storehouse of the temple of Inanna. 5 gers, about 1,500 liters, enough to feed a family for months. The tablet will be dried and stored in the temple archives, where it will remain for thousands of years, an ordinary record of an ordinary transaction that will someday tell archaeologists about the economy of ancient Sumer. The student finishes his work and sets the tablet aside to dry. He flexes his fingers, stiff from the effort, and reaches for another lump of clay. This is his life now, and it will be until he masters the art. Writing is hard. It requires years of training, endless practice, and a level of dedication that only a few possess. And this is precisely why scribes are so valuable. In a society where literacy is rare, the ability to read and write is a form of power. Scribes are needed in every aspect of Sumerian life. They work in the temples, recording offerings and managing the vast estates. They work in the palaces, drafting royal decrees and diplomatic correspondence. They work in the law courts, drawing up contracts and recording verdicts. They work as private secretaries for wealthy merchants. They are indispensable, and they know it. But writing is more than just a tool for record keeping. It is a way of preserving thought, of transmitting knowledge across time and space. The Sumerians were the first people to record their literature, their myths, their epic poetry. They wrote down the stories of their gods, the creation of the world, the great flood, the descent of Inanna into the underworld. They wrote love songs and laments, proverbs and riddles, hymns and prayers. And most famously, they wrote the Epic of Gilgamesh, the story of a great king who seeks immortality and learns to accept his mortality. This is the oldest recorded story in human history, and it is still read and studied today, more than 4,000 years after it was first written down. The clay tablets on which it was inscribed have survived earthquakes, fires, conquests, and the slow erosion of millennia. They have outlasted the civilization that created them. And this is the true miracle of writing. It allows the dead to speak to the living, to share their thoughts and experiences across the vast gulf of time. You leave the tablet house and step back out into the bright sunlight, blinking as your eyes adjust. The city is stirring again as the worst of the heat passes. Shopkeepers are opening their shutters, merchants are returning to the markets, and the streets are filling with people once more. You can hear the babble of voices, the clatter of pottery, the jingle of bronze ornaments, and you realize that everything you are experiencing, everything you are seeing, could now be recorded. The invention of writing has changed not just how information is stored, but how people think. It has created a new kind of memory, external and permanent, that does not depend on the fragile recollection of any individual. It has made possible the accumulation of knowledge across generations, the building of complex systems of law and governance, the flowering of art and literature. Writing is the technology that makes civilization possible. Without it, there can be no bureaucracy, no law code, no literature, no history. With it, human culture can begin to build upon itself, can grow and evolve in ways that would be impossible otherwise. The Sumerians did not know that they were inventing something world-changing. They were simply solving a practical problem, how to keep track of grain and livestock. But in doing so, they gave humanity one of its most powerful tools. They gave us the ability to remember. As evening approaches and the shadows begin to lengthen, you find yourself drawn toward the heart of the city, toward the towering structure that dominates the skyline, the ziggurat. Even from a distance, it commands attention, rising in massive step platforms toward the sky. As you draw closer, you begin to understand the true scale of what you are seeing. This is not simply a building. This is a mountain, an artificial mountain built by human hands, brick by brick, over generations. This is the most ambitious architectural achievement of the ancient world, and it exists for a single purpose: to bring the gods closer to Earth and humanity closer to the gods. The base of the ziggurat is enormous, covering an area the size of several city blocks. The walls are made of millions of sun-baked mud bricks, each one molded by hand, dried in the heat, and carefully laid in place. The outer faces are covered with fired bricks, harder and more durable, sometimes glazed in brilliant colors: blue for the sky, white for the clouds, black for the underworld. The whole structure rises in 3 or 4 massive tiers, each one smaller than the one below, creating a stepped pyramid that soars 40, 50, even 60 feet into the air. At the very top, reached by a long, steep staircase, is the temple itself, a small perfect jewel of a building with whitewashed walls and a dark doorway that leads into the sacred interior. This is the dwelling place of the god, the point where heaven and earth meet. You begin to climb the stairs. They are wide and shallow, designed for processions, and they run up the face of the ziggurat in a straight line, exposed to the sun and wind. As you ascend, the city falls away beneath you. You can see the network of streets and canals spreading out in all directions, the flat roofs of houses, the green of the fields beyond the walls.
You can see the river
glinting in the late afternoon light, and the distant hills on the eastern horizon. The wind is stronger up here, carrying the scent of smoke and incense. Behind you, you can hear the faint sound of chanting, a rhythmic murmur that seems to come from the temple above. Let us pause here, halfway up the ziggurat, and consider what this structure represents. In Sumerian thought, the gods were not distant, abstract beings. They were real, powerful, and intimately involved in human affairs. They controlled the forces of nature, the rains and floods, the fertility of the soil, the movements of the stars. They could bring prosperity or disaster, life or death, and they demanded service. The Sumerians believed that human beings had been created for a specific purpose: to work the land, to produce food, and to feed the gods through offerings and sacrifices. This was not seen as oppression. It was seen as the natural order of things, the way the universe was meant to function, and the temple was the mechanism through which this relationship was maintained. Each city in Sumer was dedicated to a particular deity. Uruk belonged to Inanna, the goddess of love and war, fierce and beautiful and unpredictable. Uruk was the city of Nana, the moon god, whose silver light was believed to govern the cycles of time. Eridu, the oldest of all Sumerian cities, was sacred to Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, who was said to dwell in the depths of the Abzu, the underground ocean. These were not just symbolic associations. The god was believed to actually live in the temple, to inhabit the sacred statue that stood in the innermost chamber. The temple was the god's house, and the priests were the god's servants responsible for clothing the statue, feeding it, entertaining it with music and dance, and ensuring that all the proper rituals were performed. The temple complex was vast, much larger than just the ziggurat itself. It included storehouses and workshops, kitchens and breweries, dormitories for priests and temple servants, courtyards for festivals and public gatherings. The temple owned land, often vast estates that stretched for miles outside the city walls. It employed thousands of people: farmers to work the land, laborers to maintain the canals, craftsmen to produce goods for trade, scribes to keep track of everything. The temple was, in essence, a state within the state, an economic powerhouse that controlled a significant portion of the city's wealth. And at the head of this vast organization was the high priest or priestess, a figure of immense power and influence. You continue your climb, your legs beginning to ache from the effort. The stairs seem endless, but finally you reach the top platform. The temple stands before you, small and perfect, its walls gleaming white in the fading light. The doorway is dark, and from within you can hear the sound of singing, high and clear, accompanied by the soft plucking of a lyre. You are not permitted to enter. This is the Holy of Holies, reserved for the priests and priestesses who serve the god. But you can stand here, at the threshold, and imagine what lies within. A small chamber, dim and fragrant with incense, an altar piled with offerings, bread and beer, dates and fish, jars of oil and honey. And in the center, on a raised platform, the statue of the god, carved from precious wood, dressed in robes of finest linen, adorned with jewelry of gold and lapis lazuli. The statue's eyes are made of shells inlaid with obsidian, and they seem to gaze out into the darkness with an expression that is both serene and terrible. The rituals performed here are complex and elaborate, following a calendar that governs every day of the year. There are daily offerings, morning and evening, when the god is awakened, washed, dressed, and fed. There are monthly festivals to mark the phases of the moon. There are great annual celebrations when the entire city participates, when processions wind through the streets carrying the statue of the god, when animals are sacrificed and feasts are held. The most important of these is the sacred marriage, a ritual that reenacts the union of Inanna with her consort Dumuzi. The high priestess takes the role of the goddess, the king takes the role of the god, and their symbolic union is believed to ensure the fertility of the land for the coming year. This is more than theater. For the Sumerians, the ritual is reality. By performing these rites, they are maintaining the cosmic order, ensuring that the sun rises, the crops grow, and the rivers flow. But the temple is not just a place of worship. It is also a place of pilgrimage, a destination for people from across the region who come seeking the god's favor. They come with offerings, with prayers, with questions about the future. The priests are skilled in divination, in reading the will of the gods through omens and signs. They examine the liver of a sacrificed sheep, looking for irregularities that might reveal what is to come. They interpret dreams, casting light on the hidden messages sent by the gods during sleep. They cast lots, using small marked stones to determine the answer to yes or no questions. And they observe the heavens, tracking the movements of the planets and stars, believing that the gods write their intentions across the night sky. The Sumerian view of the afterlife is dark and somber. They do not believe in a paradise waiting for the righteous or punishments for the wicked. Instead, all the dead, regardless of how they lived, descend to the same place, Ur, the land of no return. It is a shadowy realm beneath the earth, a place of dust and darkness where the spirits of the dead exist in a pale, diminished state. They are fed by the offerings of the living, the libations of water and beer poured onto the ground, the food left at gravesides. Without these offerings, the dead become restless and hungry, and they may return to haunt the living. This belief creates a powerful bond between the generations, a sense of obligation that extends beyond death. The living must care for the dead, must remember them, must feed them through ritual and prayer, and in return the dead watch over their descendants, offering guidance and protection. You turn away from the temple and look out over the city once more. The sun is setting now, casting long shadows across the streets and buildings. Smoke rises from cooking fires, carrying the smell of roasted meat and baking bread. Lamps are being lit in windows, small flames flickering in the gathering darkness. The city is coming alive in a different way, preparing for the night. And you realize that everything you have seen today, everything that makes this civilization possible, is rooted in this relationship with the divine. The Sumerians did not see themselves as masters of their world. They saw themselves as servants, participants in a cosmic drama that was far larger than any individual life. And this belief, this sense of being part of something greater, gave them the strength and the will to build these impossible cities, to tame the rivers, to create order out of chaos. They were not just building for themselves, they were building for the gods. And in doing so, they built a legacy that would outlast them by thousands of years. Night has fallen now, and the city is wrapped in darkness, punctuated by small pools of lamplight. The air has cooled, bringing relief from the oppressive heat of the day. You descend from the ziggurat, slowly, carefully, your hand trailing along the rough brick of the wall for guidance. When you reach the bottom, you find yourself in one of the residential quarters, a maze of narrow streets and alleyways where ordinary Sumerians lived their daily lives. The sounds of the city at night surround you, the murmur of voices from within houses, the cry of a baby, the bark of a dog, the distant splash of water being drawn from a well. You pass by open doorways and catch glimpses of domestic life, families gathered around small oil lamps, sharing a meal of bread and onions, telling stories, preparing for sleep. Let us step inside one of these houses and see how the majority of Sumerians lived. This is the home of a craftsman, a potter who makes his living producing the countless clay vessels that Sumerian society requires. Storage jars for grain and oil, cooking pots, serving bowls, cups for beer, lamps for lighting. His house is modest but comfortable, built around a central courtyard that is open to the sky. The courtyard is the heart of the home, a place where the family cooks, eats, works and sleeps during the hot summer nights. Around the courtyard are several small rooms, a bedroom where the family sleeps during the cooler months, a storeroom for grain and other supplies, and a workshop where the potter keeps his wheel and his tools. The walls are made of mud brick, the same material that builds the great temples and palaces, but these are simpler, rougher, made by the potter himself from the clay-rich soil of the riverbank. The floor is packed earth, smooth and hard from years of use. There are no windows, only small vents high in the walls to allow air to circulate. The roof is flat, made of reeds laid over wooden beams and covered with a thick layer of mud. It is strong enough to walk on, and on hot nights, the family often sleeps up there, under the stars, where the breeze brings some relief from the heat. The potter's name is Ur-Nammu, and he is a free man, neither noble nor slave, but somewhere in between. He owns his house and his workshop. He pays taxes to the temple and owes several days of labor each year for the maintenance of the canals. He is proud of his craft, as his father was before him, and as he hopes his son will be after him. He learned the art of pottery as a boy, watching his father work the wheel, studying the way clay responds to pressure and heat, mastering the delicate balance between too much and too little water. Now his hands move with the unconscious grace of long practice, shaping the spinning clay into forms that are both functional and beautiful. His wife, whose name is Ninala, manages the household. She rises before dawn to grind barley into flour on a flat stone quern, a task that takes hours of backbreaking labor. The flour is mixed with water and shaped into flat loaves that are baked in a small clay oven in the courtyard. She brews beer, the staple drink of Sumerian society, fermenting barley in large jars and straining it through reed baskets. She weaves cloth on a simple loom, transforming wool from the family's small flock of sheep into the tunics and robes that her family wears. She cares for the children, teaches her daughters the skills they will need as wives and mothers, and manages the household finances with the same careful attention to detail that a temple scribe applies to the grain accounts. The family's diet is simple but adequate. Barley and bread are the foundation of every meal. Onions, leeks, and garlic add flavor. Dates provide sweetness. Fish from the river and canals are common, either fresh or dried and salted for storage. Meat is a luxury reserved for festivals and special occasions, when a sheep or goat might be slaughtered and roasted. Beer is drunk by everyone, men, women, and children, because it is safer than water and provides valuable calories. It is not the clear filtered beverage we know today, but a thick, nutritious liquid full of grain particles, drunk through a long reed straw to filter out the sediment. The children of the house, 2 boys and a girl, are playing in the courtyard, their laughter echoing off the walls. The older boy, about 10 years old, will soon begin to learn his father's trade. The younger boy, still a toddler, clings to his mother's skirts. The girl, 8 years old, already helps with the household chores, grinding grain, carrying water, watching the younger children. Their childhood is short. By the time they reach their early teens, they will be considered adults, ready for marriage and the responsibilities that come with it. Life expectancy is not long by modern standards. Many children die before their 5th birthday, victims of disease, malnutrition, or accidents. Those who survive to adulthood can expect to live into their 40s or 50s if they are lucky, though some live longer. The rhythm of life is governed by the seasons, by the cycle of planting and harvest, by the rituals of the temple and the demands of the state. Social hierarchy in Sumer is clear and rigid, though not as brutal as in some later civilizations. At the top are the nobility, the Lugol or great men, who own vast estates and wield political power. Below them are the priests and priestesses, who control the temples and their enormous wealth. Then come the merchants and skilled craftsmen like Namu, free men who own their own property and labor. Below them are the Mushkanim, the commoners, who work as laborers, farmers, and servants. And at the bottom are the slaves, the Wardu, prisoners of war or people who have fallen into debt. Slavery in Sumer is not as harsh as it would become in later societies. Slaves have some legal rights. They can own property, conduct business, and even buy their freedom. But they are still property, subject to the will of their masters, and their lives are hard. You leave the potter's house and continue through the streets, making your way toward the commercial district. Even at night, there is activity here. The taverns are open, their doorways spilling light and noise into the street. Inside, men gather to drink beer, play board games, and exchange gossip and news. Women, too, are present, for Sumerian society is less restrictive in some ways than later civilizations. Women can own property, run businesses, and even serve as priestesses. The most famous tavern keepers are women, and they are respected members of the community, though they must be careful. The law codes are strict about watering down beer or overcharging customers. A tavern keeper found guilty of such fraud can be thrown into the river. You pass by a group of men playing the royal game of Ur, an ancient board game that has been popular in Mesopotamia for centuries. The board is beautifully crafted, inlaid with shell and lapis lazuli, and the pieces are carved from bone. The players throw tetrahedral dice and move their pieces along a path of squares, racing to get all their pieces to the end before their opponent. The game is more than just entertainment. It is a metaphor for life, for the unpredictable journey from birth to death, guided by fate and the will of the gods. Music fills the air, the haunting sound of a lyre drifting out from one of the houses. The lyre is the most important instrument in Sumerian culture, its sweet, resonant tones considered suitable for both religious ceremonies and secular entertainment. The strings are made from sheep gut, stretched over a wooden frame decorated with the head of a bull. The musician plucks the strings with his fingers, creating melodies that are both beautiful and melancholic, songs of love and loss, of heroes and gods. There are also drums, flutes made from reeds, and sistrum, a kind of rattle made from bronze. Music is everywhere in Sumerian life, from the hymns sung in the temples to the work songs that accompany labor in the fields. As you walk, you become aware of the underlying order that governs all of this. The streets, though narrow and winding, are not random. There is a pattern here, a logic that reflects the social organization of the city. The wealthy live near the temple precinct, in large houses with multiple rooms and courtyards. The craftsmen and merchants live in the middle zones, in houses like Namus. The poor live on the outskirts, in smaller, more crowded dwellings. There are separate quarters for foreigners, for merchants from other cities, for the small but growing population of non-Sumerians who have been drawn to the city by its wealth and opportunity. And everywhere there is the sense of a society that is both ancient and innovative, traditional and experimental. The Sumerians are constantly inventing, constantly adapting, constantly pushing the boundaries of what is possible. They have invented the wheel, not just for transport, but for the potter's craft. They have invented the plow, allowing a single man to till more land in a day than a team of men with hoes. They have invented bronze, mixing copper and tin to create a metal that is harder and more durable than either element alone. They have invented mathematics, developing a sophisticated number system based on 60 that we still use today when we count minutes and seconds, when we measure angles in a circle. They have invented astronomy, tracking the movements of the planets and stars with a precision that allows them to create accurate calendars and predict eclipses. All of this innovation springs from the same source, the need to solve practical problems, to make life more efficient, more predictable, more controlled. You find yourself back near the city walls, in a quiet section of the city where the noise and bustle have faded away. The walls loom above you, massive and reassuring, a barrier between the ordered world of the city and the chaos of the world beyond. You can hear guards on the ramparts above, calling out to each other, their voices carrying in the still night air. And you realize that this is what civilization means: the creation of boundaries, the establishment of order, the transformation of a dangerous, unpredictable world into something that can be understood, controlled, and shaped according to human will. The Sumerians were the first to attempt this on a grand scale, and while their experiment would not last forever, while their cities would eventually fall and their language would be forgotten, the example they set would endure. They showed that it was possible. They proved that human beings could build something greater than themselves, something that would outlast any individual life and carry forward into the future. Dawn is approaching again, and you find yourself in the public square near the palace of the Ensi, the governor of the city. This is where justice is administered, where disputes are resolved, where the laws that govern Sumerian society are made visible and enforced. As the first light touches the eastern horizon, people begin to gather. There are plaintiffs and defendants, witnesses and curious onlookers. There are scribes with their clay tablets, ready to record the proceedings. And there are the judges, sober men in formal robes seated on raised platforms, their expressions grave with the weight of their responsibility. Law in Sumer is not an abstract concept, it is a practical necessity, a tool for maintaining order in a complex society where thousands of people must live together in close proximity. Without law, without a system for resolving conflicts and punishing wrongdoers, the city would collapse into chaos. And so the Sumerians have developed one of the world's first comprehensive legal systems, complete with written codes, professional judges, and formal court procedures. The most famous of these codes is the Code of Ur-Nammu, named after a king who ruled Ur around 2100 BCE, though fragments of even earlier legal texts have been found. These are not divine commandments handed down from the gods. They are practical regulations created by human rulers to govern human behavior. The laws cover every aspect of daily life. There are laws governing property rights, specifying what happens if someone's ox gores a neighbor's sheep or if a wall collapses and damages an adjacent house. There are laws about marriage and divorce, outlining the rights and responsibilities of husbands and wives. There are laws about slavery, setting limits on how slaves can be treated and under what conditions they can gain their freedom. There are laws about theft, assault, and murder, specifying the punishments for each offense. And perhaps most importantly, there are laws about contracts, the written agreements that bind people to their promises and make commerce possible. The punishments specified in Sumerian law are surprisingly sophisticated. Unlike later codes that rely heavily on physical mutilation or death, Sumerian law often prescribes monetary compensation. If you injure someone, you must pay them a fine calculated according to the severity of the injury and the social status of the victim. If you damage someone's property, you must pay for the repairs or provide replacement goods. The goal is not vengeance, but restoration, making the victim whole again. Of course, there are exceptions. Serious crimes like premeditated murder or repeated theft can still result in death. But even then, the process is formal and deliberate. The accused has the right to present evidence and call witnesses. The judges consider the testimony carefully before reaching a verdict. You watch as a case is heard. A farmer accuses his neighbor of diverting water from a shared irrigation canal, depriving his fields of the water they need. The neighbor denies the charge, claiming that the farmer's own negligence in maintaining his portion of the dike is the real problem. Witnesses are called. Men who have walked the canal and observed the situation. A scribe reads from a tablet that documents the original agreement about water sharing made when the land was first divided. The judges ask questions, seek clarification, weigh the evidence. Finally, they reach a decision. The neighbor is found guilty, but the punishment is measured. He must pay a fine to the farmer and is ordered to restore the canal to its proper configuration. He must also perform several days of labor repairing the shared dike. The judgment is recorded on a clay tablet, sealed with the judge's marks and filed in the palace archives. If either party violates the terms of the judgment, they can be brought back before the court and face more severe penalties. This system of written law and formal justice is revolutionary. In many parts of the world, disputes are still resolved through violence or vendetta, with families taking revenge on each other in endless cycles of bloodshed. But in Sumer, there is an alternative. There is a mechanism for resolving conflicts peacefully, for imposing order through reason rather than force. This does not mean that Sumerian society is always just or fair. The rich have advantages that the poor do not. A nobleman accused of a crime may receive a lighter sentence than a commoner guilty of the same offense. Slaves have fewer rights than free men. Women, while they enjoy more legal protections than in some later societies, are still subject to the authority of their fathers and husbands in many matters. But the principle is established: law, not power, should govern human affairs. And this principle, imperfect as its application may be, is one of the great gifts that Sumer will give to the future. The morning progresses, and the cases continue. A merchant accuses a business partner of cheating him in a transaction. A woman seeks a divorce from an abusive husband. A slave petitions for his freedom, claiming that he has worked long enough to pay off the debt that enslaved him. Each case is heard, each decision recorded, and through it all you see the machinery of civilization at work. This is not simply about resolving individual disputes. It is about creating a shared sense of order, a common understanding that there are rules, that those rules apply to everyone, and that those who break the rules will face consequences. It is about building trust, the invisible foundation upon which all complex societies rest. As the sun climbs higher and the heat returns, you leave the square and make your way through the streets toward the city's military quarter. For all its achievements in law and literacy, in trade and technology, Sumer is not a peaceful place. The land between the rivers is divided into a dozen independent city-states, each one jealous of its neighbors, each one competing for control of water, land and trade routes. Ur and Uruk, Lagash and Umma, Kish and Nippur, these cities are rivals, sometimes allies but more often enemies. And so they maintain armies, train soldiers, build fortifications, and prepare for war. The military barracks are located near the city gates, a cluster of long, low buildings where soldiers live and train. You can hear them now, the rhythmic stamp of feet, the clash of bronze weapons, the shouts of commanders drilling their men. You approach carefully, staying to the side of the training ground where you will not be in the way. What you see is both impressive and terrifying. These are professional soldiers, men who have dedicated their lives to the art of war. They are organized into units, each one specializing in a particular type of combat. There are spearmen, their long bronze-tipped spears held at the ready, trained to fight in tight formation. There are archers, their composite bows capable of launching arrows with deadly accuracy. There are slingers, ordinary-looking men who can hurl stones with enough force to crack a skull or shatter a shield. And there are charioteers, the elite of the army, wealthy men who own their own chariots and horses, trained from childhood in the difficult art of fighting from a moving platform. The chariot is a relatively new invention, but it has already transformed warfare. It is a light, two-wheeled vehicle pulled by a pair of horses or onagers, the wild asses that have been domesticated for this purpose. The chariot carries two men, a driver who controls the animals and a warrior who fights. The warrior is armed with a bow or javelins, and he uses the speed and mobility of the chariot to strike quickly and then retreat before the enemy can respond. In open battle, a squadron of chariots can shatter an infantry formation, running down soldiers who cannot match their speed. But chariots have limitations. They are expensive, requiring skilled craftsmen to build and maintain them. They require flat, open terrain to be effective, and they are vulnerable to rough ground, ditches and obstacles that can break their wheels or trap them. The infantry is the backbone of the army. These are the men who will stand in the phalanx, shoulder to shoulder, shield overlapping shield, spear points bristling like a hedge of bronze. The Sumerians did not invent the phalanx, but they perfected it, turning it into a disciplined, coordinated fighting machine. The soldiers train endlessly, practicing the movements until they become automatic: the advance in step, the halt, the thrust, the defensive formation. They learn to trust the men beside them, to know that if they hold their position, their comrades will hold theirs. They learn to suppress their fear, to march toward the enemy, even when every instinct screams at them to run. This is not natural. It requires training, discipline, and a kind of courage that is not the absence of fear but the mastery of it. You watch as a unit practices an assault on a mock fortification, a section of wall built at the edge of the training ground. The soldiers carry long scaling ladders, heavy and awkward but necessary for storming walls. They advance in formation, shields raised to protect themselves from imaginary arrows and stones. When they reach the wall, they prop the ladders against it and begin to climb, one after another, moving with surprising speed despite their armor. At the top, they vault over the wall and engage in hand-to-hand combat with other soldiers playing the role of defenders. It is brutal, chaotic, exhausting work. Men fall, some truly injured despite the training weapons. But they pick themselves up and continue. This is what it means to be a soldier. This is the price of security in a dangerous world. Warfare in Sumer is not random or chaotic. It follows patterns, rituals even. Before a battle, the priests consult the omens, examining the entrails of sacrificed animals to determine if the gods favor the enterprise. If the omens are bad, the campaign may be delayed or called off entirely. If the omens are good, the army marches out with confidence, believing that the gods are on their side. Battles themselves are often preceded by negotiations, by exchanges of ambassadors, by attempts to resolve disputes without bloodshed. But when diplomacy fails, when honor demands it, or when resources are at stake, the armies meet on the field and the killing begins. The weapons they carry are bronze: swords, spears, axes, daggers. Bronze is an alloy of copper and tin, harder and more durable than pure copper, capable of holding an edge and withstanding the shock of combat. But it is also expensive, requiring materials that must be imported from distant lands. Not every soldier can afford a bronze weapon. Many carry spears with fire-hardened wooden tips or clubs studded with stone. Armor too is expensive. The wealthiest soldiers wear bronze helmets and breastplates, leather kilts reinforced with bronze scales. But most soldiers have only simple leather armor or thick wool cloaks that offer minimal protection. The poorest have nothing at all, going into battle with only a wooden shield and their courage. The goal of Sumerian warfare is not annihilation, but conquest. The victorious city does not usually massacre the population of the defeated. Instead, they impose tribute, demanding payments of grain, livestock, and precious goods. They may take hostages, members of the ruling family held as guarantees of good behavior. They may install a puppet ruler, someone loyal to the victors who will govern the defeated city on their behalf. And they may demand labor, conscripting men to work on projects in the victorious city, to dig canals or build walls or serve in the army. War is expensive, in both blood and treasure, and the goal is to make it profitable, to extract enough wealth from the defeated to justify the cost of victory. But there is also glory in war, honor and fame for those who fight bravely. The greatest warriors are celebrated in song and story, their names recorded on clay tablets and stone monuments. Kings erect stelas, upright stone slabs carved with scenes of their triumphs. One of the most famous is the Stela to the Vultures, a monument from the city-state of Lagash that commemorates a victory over Umma. The carvings show the king leading his soldiers into battle, the enemy fleeing in terror, and vultures descending to feast on the dead. It is both a record of historical fact and a piece of propaganda, a message to future generations about the power and glory of Lagash. This is how history is written in Sumer, not just in words, but in images carved in stone, in monuments that will outlast the memories of those who lived through the events. The heat of midday drives you to seek shelter once again, and you find yourself in a different kind of building, one that hums with quiet activity and intellectual focus. This is another Adaba, a tablet house, but this one is different from the scribe school you visited earlier. This is a center of higher learning, a place where scholars study not just the practical arts of writing and accounting, but the deeper mysteries of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. The air here is cool and shadowed, the thick walls keeping out the brutal sun. Scribes sit at low tables, their clay tablets before them, their styluses moving with practiced precision. But what they are writing is not inventory lists or business contracts. They are calculating the movements of the planets, charting the paths of the stars, solving complex mathematical problems, recording observations about the natural world. Let us begin with mathematics, for this is one of the areas where the Sumerians truly excelled. They did not develop mathematics out of abstract curiosity. They developed it because they needed it. When you are managing vast estates, distributing rations to thousands of workers, calculating taxes, planning irrigation projects, you need to be able to count, to measure, to calculate accurately. And so the Sumerians created a sophisticated mathematical system, one that would influence all later civilizations in the region, and through them the entire world. The foundation of Sumerian mathematics is their number system, which is based on the number 60. This is called a sexagesimal system, and we still use it today when we divide an hour into 60 minutes, a minute into 60 seconds, or a circle into 360 degrees. Why 60? It is a number with many factors. It can be evenly divided by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. This makes calculations easier, especially when you are working with fractions. The Sumerians represented numbers using a combination of two symbols, a vertical wedge for 1 and a corner wedge for 10. By repeating and combining these symbols, they could write any number. They also developed the concept of place value, the idea that the position of a symbol determines its value, just as in our modern decimal system. You watch as a scribe works through a problem. He is calculating the area of a field, a plot of land that needs to be surveyed and divided among several owners. The field is not a simple rectangle. It has irregular sides, and the calculation requires knowledge of geometry. The scribe draws a diagram on his tablet, marking the dimensions of each side. Then he begins his calculations, using formulas that have been passed down through generations of scribes. He multiplies, divides, adds, and subtracts, his stylus moving quickly across the clay. Within minutes, he has the answer, expressed in units of area that correspond to how much barley the field can produce. This is not abstract mathematics. This is practical, applied knowledge that has real-world consequences. If the scribe makes an error, someone will plant too little or too much, will harvest too little, will go hungry. But Sumerian mathematics goes beyond simple arithmetic and geometry. There are tablets that show calculations of square roots and cube roots, tables of reciprocals that allow for division, even primitive forms of algebra, where unknown quantities are represented by symbols and solved through manipulation of equations. These are sophisticated concepts, the kind of abstract thinking that we usually associate with much later civilizations, with the Greeks or the Arabs. But the Sumerians were doing this 4,000 years ago, working with clay and reeds, building the foundations of mathematics as we know it. From mathematics, your attention is drawn to another group of scholars, these ones focused on the heavens. Astronomy in Sumer is not separate from religion. The two are intertwined, inseparable. The Sumerians believed that the gods communicate through the movements of celestial bodies, that the positions of the planets and stars can reveal the will of heaven, and so they watch the sky with intense methodical attention. They track the phases of the moon, noting when it waxes and wanes, using it to create a calendar that divides the year into 12 lunar months. They observe the wandering stars, the planets, which they distinguish from the fixed stars by their movement across the sky. They name the planets after their gods. Inanna, the goddess of love and war, is the planet Venus, bright and beautiful. Ninurta, the god of war, is the planet Mars, red and ominous. Marduk, who will become the chief god of Babylon, is the planet Jupiter, the largest and most stately. The priests who study the heavens keep careful records, noting the positions of planets and stars, recording eclipses and comets, any unusual phenomena that might be signs from the gods. Over time, these observations accumulate into vast databases of astronomical knowledge. The priests learn to predict the movements of the moon and planets with remarkable accuracy. They can forecast eclipses, knowing when the moon will pass into the Earth's shadow, when the sun will be covered by the moon's disk. This knowledge gives them immense power and prestige. They are the interpreters of divine will, the ones who can read the messages written in the heavens. But the ultimate purpose of all this observation is practical, not theoretical. The priests are trying to answer specific questions. Is this a good time to plant? Should the king go to war? Will the harvest be abundant? They develop a complex system of celestial omens, correlating the positions and movements of heavenly bodies with events on Earth. If Jupiter is in a certain constellation when the king falls ill, it means one thing. If Venus rises before the sun on a particular day, it means another. These correlations are recorded in omen texts, long lists of if-then statements. If this happens in the sky, then that will happen on Earth. Modern science would say that these correlations are meaningless, that the movements of planets have no influence on human affairs. But for the Sumerians, the universe is a unified whole. Heaven and earth are connected, part of the same cosmic order, and what happens in one realm reflects and influences what happens in the other. Medicine in Sumer is similarly intertwined with religion and magic. Disease is often understood as the result of demonic possession or divine punishment, and treatment involves not just physical remedies, but also prayers, incantations and rituals to drive out the evil spirits or appease the angry gods. But alongside this magical understanding, there is also a practical, empirical approach. Sumerian medical texts describe hundreds of ailments and their treatments based on centuries of accumulated observation and experience. There are prescriptions for poultices and salves made from plants, minerals, and animal products. There are instructions for setting broken bones, stitching wounds, treating infections. There are even primitive forms of surgery, though these are rare and risky, performed only when all other options have been exhausted. The physician, the Asu, is a skilled professional who has trained for years to learn his craft. He knows the properties of dozens of medicinal plants, which ones reduce fever, which ones ease pain, which ones promote healing. He knows how to prepare these plants, how to extract their active ingredients through grinding, boiling, or fermentation. He knows anatomy, at least in a practical sense, understanding where the major organs are located, how blood flows, how bones and muscles work together. And he knows diagnosis, the art of examining a patient, asking questions about their symptoms, observing their appearance, feeling their pulse, and using all of this information to determine what is wrong and how best to treat it. But there is another kind of healer in Sumer, the Esipu, the exorcist or incantation priest. When physical remedies fail, when disease persists despite the physician's best efforts, the Esipu is called. He does not treat the body. He treats the spirit. He performs rituals to drive out demons, recites incantations to break curses, makes offerings to appease the gods. He might create a clay figurine representing the demon causing the illness, then destroy it in a symbolic act of banishment. He might purify the patient with water blessed by the temple, or with smoke from burning incense. The line between medicine and magic is blurred, and both are seen as necessary. The body and the spirit are not separate. They are different aspects of the same person, and true healing requires treating both. You move on through the tablet house, pausing at a table where a young scholar is copying an ancient text. It is not a legal document or an astronomical table. It is literature, poetry, a hymn to the goddess Inanna. The scholar's task is to preserve this text, to ensure that it is not lost, that future generations will be able to read it and understand it. This is one of the most important functions of the scribal schools, the preservation and transmission of culture. The great works of Sumerian literature are copied over and over again, each generation of scribes learning from the texts of their predecessors, adding their own commentaries and interpretations. The most famous of these works is the Epic of Gilgamesh, the story of a king of Uruk who seeks immortality. Gilgamesh is a powerful, arrogant ruler who abuses his people. The gods create a wild man, Enkidu, to challenge him. The two fight, then become close friends. Together they embark on adventures, slaying monsters and defying the gods. But when Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh is devastated. He realizes that he too will die, that all his power and glory will not save him from mortality. And so he sets out on a quest to find eternal life, traveling to the ends of the earth, confronting dangers and temptations, seeking the secret of immortality from the one man who has achieved it, Utnapishtim, the survivor of the Great Flood. But in the end, Gilgamesh learns that immortality is not for mortals. The gods have decreed that humans must die. The best he can do is accept this fate and find meaning in the time he has, in the works he creates, in the legacy he leaves behind. This story, written on clay tablets more than 4,000 years ago, speaks to something fundamental in the human experience: the confrontation with mortality, the search for meaning in a finite existence, the tension between the desire for immortality and the acceptance of death. It is a story that resonates across the centuries, that remains powerful and relevant even today. And it is just one example of the rich literary tradition that the Sumerians created. There are myths about the creation of the world, about the Great Flood, about the descent of the goddess Inanna into the underworld. There are love songs and laments, proverbs and riddles, hymns and prayers. All of this is written down, preserved in the clay, passed from generation to generation. The sun is moving toward the western horizon now, and the light in the tablet house is growing dim. The scholars are finishing their work, carefully storing their tablets on shelves where they will be safe from damage. You step back out into the street, blinking in the bright light, and you realize that what you have witnessed is nothing less than the birth of human knowledge as an accumulated transmittable tradition. Before writing, knowledge lived only in memory, fragile and easily lost. With writing, knowledge can be preserved, built upon, refined, and passed down through the ages. The scribes of Sumer are not just record keepers, they are the guardians of civilization's memory, the link between past and future, the foundation upon which all later achievements will rest. Time passes, as it always does. Days turn into years, years into generations, generations into centuries. The great cities of Sumer continue to rise, to prosper, to compete with one another for dominance. But nothing lasts forever, and even as you stand in the streets of Uruk, even as you watch the scribes at their tablets and the priests on their ziggurats, the seeds of decline are already being sown. Let us move forward now, stepping through the centuries, watching as the world of ancient Sumer begins to change. The first challenge comes from the land itself, from the very rivers that gave life to this civilization. For centuries, the Sumerians have been diverting water from the Tigris and Euphrates, channeling it through canals to irrigate their fields. This has allowed them to produce enormous harvests, to support large populations, to build their magnificent cities. But irrigation comes with a hidden cost, one that reveals itself slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, but with devastating consequences over time. The problem is salt. When water evaporates from irrigated fields, it leaves behind the minerals that were dissolved in it, and in this region, the groundwater contains high levels of salt, year after year. As the fields are watered and the water evaporates, the salt accumulates in the soil. At first it does not matter. The soil is so fertile that the crops grow well despite the increasing salinity, but gradually, over decades and centuries, the salt builds up to levels that plants cannot tolerate. Barley, which is relatively salt-tolerant, begins to struggle. Wheat, which is more sensitive, fails entirely and is gradually abandoned. Yields decline. The surplus that supported the cities begins to shrink. Fields that once produced abundant harvests now yield only half as much, then a third, then almost nothing. And once the process has gone too far, it is nearly impossible to reverse. The Sumerians are aware of the problem. They try to combat it, digging new canals to bring fresh water, leaving fields fallow to allow the salts to leach away, experimenting with different crops and farming methods. But the challenge is immense. The fundamental problem is that they are asking the land to produce more than it can sustainably provide, and as the productivity of the soil declines, the economic foundation of their civilization begins to erode. There is less grain to store in the granaries, less surplus to trade, less wealth to fund the temples and palaces, less security against bad harvests and hard times. At the same time, the rivers themselves are changing. The Tigris and Euphrates are not stable watercourses. They shift and meander, breaking through their banks, changing course, sometimes dramatically. A city that was once on the riverbank may find itself several miles from the water as the river carves a new channel. Canals that once brought water to the fields may suddenly run dry as their source moves elsewhere. Entire regions can be transformed overnight by a catastrophic flood that reshapes the landscape. The Sumerians have always lived with this uncertainty, but as their cities grow larger and more complex, as their dependence on the irrigation system becomes more total, these natural changes become more and more disruptive. There are political problems as well. The city-states of Sumer have never been united under a single ruler. They are independent, competitive, often hostile to one another. Wars between cities are common, draining resources, disrupting trade, destroying the infrastructure of canals and dikes that everyone depends on. In the early days, when the cities were small and resilient, this system worked well enough. But as the cities grow larger, as the population increases, as the margin for error shrinks, the constant warfare becomes more and more damaging. A defeated city cannot simply rebuild and move on. It suffers long-term consequences, fields left untended, canals falling into disrepair, population decline as people flee to safer regions. And then from outside, new pressures begin to appear. Sumer has always been surrounded by other peoples, nomadic pastoralists in the deserts to the west and south, mountain dwellers in the Zagros to the east, farming communities in the hills to the north. For centuries these peoples have existed on the periphery of Sumerian civilization, sometimes trading with the cities, sometimes raiding them, but never posing a serious threat to their existence. But now, that is beginning to change. To the north, in the region around the city of Akkad, A Semitic-speaking people have been gradually settling, learning from the Sumerians, adopting their writing system and their technologies, but maintaining their own language and culture. Around 2334 BCE, a ruler emerges from this northern region, who will change everything. His name is Sargon, and he is one of history's great conquerors, a military genius who sees the divided city-states of Sumer not as rivals to be respected, but as territories to be conquered and unified. Sargon builds an army unlike anything that has been seen before. It is large, well-trained, and mobile, capable of moving quickly across great distances, striking before the enemy can prepare. He uses new tactics, new weapons, new strategies, and he is utterly ruthless. One by one, the cities of Sumer fall to him. Uruk, Lagash, Umma, the great city-states that have existed independently for thousands of years are conquered and absorbed into Sargon's empire. This is the Akkadian Empire, the first true empire in history, and it marks the beginning of the end for Sumerian independence. Sargon does not destroy Sumerian culture. He adopts it, respects it, even preserves it. He uses Sumerian scribes to run his administration. He honors the Sumerian gods, makes offerings at their temples, but he also imposes his own language, Akkadian, as the language of government and trade. Sumerian begins to decline, shifting from a living spoken language to a liturgical one, used primarily in religious ceremonies and scholarly texts, much as Latin would be used in medieval Europe long after it ceased to be anyone's native tongue. The Akkadian Empire does not last long. Within a few generations it fragments, torn apart by internal rebellions and invasions from mountain peoples to the east. The Gutians, who are described in Sumerian texts as barbarians, destroyers of cities. There is a period of chaos, a dark age where records are sparse and cities are abandoned. But Sumer is not finished yet. Around 2112 BCE, a new dynasty rises in the city of Ur, the third dynasty, and for a brief shining moment, it looks as though Sumerian civilization might be restored to its former glory. The kings of this dynasty, especially Ur-Nammu and his son Shulgi, are great builders and reformers. They rebuild the ziggurats, codify the laws, restore the canal systems, and bring a measure of peace and prosperity back to the land. But it is a final flowering, beautiful but brief. The third dynasty of Ur lasts barely a century before it too collapses, overwhelmed by the same pressures that brought down its predecessors: environmental degradation, political instability, and invasions from outside. The final blow comes from the west, from the Amorites, another Semitic-speaking people who have been moving into Mesopotamia in increasing numbers. They are not conquerors in the mold of Sargon. They do not come with vast armies to overthrow the cities in single decisive campaigns. They come as migrants, settling in small groups, intermarrying with the local population, gradually becoming the majority. And as they do, the culture changes. Sumerian is replaced by Akkadian as the common language. Sumerian gods are merged with Semitic deities, creating a new hybrid pantheon. Sumerian political traditions are adapted to serve new rulers. By 2000 BCE, Sumerian civilization, as a distinct entity, has ceased to exist. The cities remain, but they are no longer Sumerian cities. The language is still written and studied, but it is no longer spoken in the streets. The gods are still worshipped, but their names are now pronounced in Akkadian. What was once the heartland of Sumerian culture is now the heartland of a new civilization, Babylonian, which will have its own great achievements and its own long history. But Babylon is the heir of Sumeri, not its replacement. Everything that makes Babylonian civilization great, its writing system, its legal codes, its literature, its mathematics and astronomy, its temple architecture, its agricultural techniques, all of this was inherited from the Sumerians, adapted and elaborated, but fundamentally unchanged. You are standing now in the ruins of Ur, centuries after its glory days have passed. The great ziggurat is still here, its stepped platforms rising above the flat plain. But it is weathered and crumbling, and grass grows in the cracks between the bricks. The city walls are broken in places, and sand has drifted into the streets. The population has declined, and whole quarters of the city stand empty, the houses collapsing back into the earth from which they came. But there are still people here, still priests maintaining the old rituals in the temple, still merchants trading in the markets, still farmers working the fields beyond the walls. life continues, but it is diminished, a pale shadow of what once was. And yet, as you walk through these ruins, as you run your hand along the ancient brickwork, you realize that what the Sumerians built was not just cities and canals and temples. They built something more fundamental, more lasting. They built the very idea of civilization itself. They proved that it was possible for human beings to live together in large, complex societies, to organize themselves, to create laws and institutions, to preserve knowledge, to build monuments that would outlast any individual life. They showed that human beings were not limited to small tribes wandering the wilderness. They could build cities. They could write their thoughts and preserve them for future generations. They could understand the movements of the stars and the properties of numbers. They could create art and literature that would speak to people thousands of years in the future. This was the gift of Sumer, the proof that civilization was possible. Let us step forward now, through time once more, leaving the ancient world behind and arriving in the modern era, in the 19th and 20th centuries, when the cities of Sumer were rediscovered after millennia of oblivion. For thousands of years, the great civilization of Mesopotamia was forgotten. The cities were buried under sand and earth. The writing was unreadable, the clay tablets scattered and broken. The very existence of the Sumerians was unknown. The Bible mentioned Babylon and Assyria, the later Mesopotamian empires, but of Sumer there was no trace in historical memory. The ancient Greeks and Romans knew nothing of it. The medieval Arabs who lived in Iraq did not know that beneath their feet lay the ruins of the world's first cities. But in the 19th century, European explorers and archaeologists began to take an interest in the ancient Near East. They heard rumors of great mounds of earth that dotted the Iraqi landscape, mounds that local people called tells. These tells were unnatural, too regular in shape, too high, too isolated. They had to be the remains of ancient settlements, layer upon layer of mud brick buildings, each generation building on the ruins of the last until the cities rose high above the surrounding plain. The archaeologists began to dig, and what they found astonished them. At first, they found the cities of Assyria and Babylon, which were known from ancient texts. They uncovered palaces and temples, walls and gates, and most importantly, libraries full of clay tablets inscribed with a strange wedge-shaped script. This was cuneiform, though no one could read it at first. It took decades of painstaking work, comparing texts, looking for bilingual inscriptions, gradually deciphering the symbols to unlock the language. And when they did, they discovered that there were multiple languages written in cuneiform: Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian. But there was also another language, older and stranger, a language that did not belong to any known language family. This was Sumerian. As the excavations continued, as the archaeologists dug deeper into the tells, they found older and older layers, cities that predated Babylon and Assyria by thousands of years. They found the great ziggurat of Ur, buried under sand and rubble. They found the temples of Uruk, the palaces of Lagash, the walls and gates of countless cities. And they found tablets, tens of thousands of tablets, inscribed with Sumerian cuneiform. These tablets were the voice of a forgotten civilization, speaking across 5,000 years. They told of kings and priests, of laws and contracts, of myths and poems, of the daily business of running a city, of the universal human experiences of love and loss, triumph and tragedy. One of the most important discoveries was made at the city of Nippur, where archaeologists found the tablet house, the scribal school, with its library of ancient texts. Here were copies of the Epic of Gilgamesh, hymns to the gods, mathematical tables, astronomical observations, medical prescriptions, legal codes. The sheer volume of material was overwhelming, and scholars are still working through it today, translating tablets, piecing together fragments, reconstructing the literature and history of ancient Sumer. Each tablet is a window into the past, a glimpse of how people thought and lived in the world's first civilization. The physical remains of Sumerian cities can still be visited today, though they are shadows of what they once were. The ziggurat of Ur still stands, partially reconstructed by archaeologists to give visitors a sense of its original grandeur. You can climb its stairs and stand at the top, looking out over the Iraqi desert, and imagine the city as it once was. The streets and houses, the markets and workshops, the canals bringing water from the river. The site of Uruk is there too, though less well preserved, the outlines of its great walls still visible, the remains of its temples marked by low mounds of rubble. Eridu, the oldest Sumerian city, is now just a series of low hills in the desert, difficult to distinguish from the natural landscape unless you know what you are looking for. These ruins are fragile, vulnerable to the elements and to human conflict. Uruk has been a war zone for much of the recent past, and many archaeological sites have been damaged or looted. Artifacts have been stolen and sold on the black market. Ancient buildings have been destroyed by modern construction or by the simple neglect that comes when there is no money or political will to preserve them. But the tablets at least are safe. Tens of thousands of them are preserved in museums around the world, in London and Paris, in Berlin and Philadelphia, in Baghdad and Istanbul. They are being photographed, digitized, made available to scholars online, and they are being translated, slowly but steadily, revealing more and more about the people who wrote them. What do we learn from these tablets? We learn that the Sumerians were not so different from us. They worried about money and debts. They argued with their neighbors over property lines. They complained about lazy workers and dishonest business partners. They wrote love letters and angry letters, letters asking for help and letters offering advice. They recorded their dreams and their fears, their hopes for the future and their memories of the past. They were human beings living in a world that was strange and distant from ours in many ways, but fundamentally similar in others. They faced the same existential questions that we face. What is the meaning of life? What happens after we die? How should we treat each other? What is justice? What is love? And they attempted to answer these questions, not just through philosophy and religion, but through the creation of institutions and systems that would allow people to live together in peace and prosperity. They invented writing so that knowledge could be preserved. They created laws so that disputes could be resolved fairly. They built cities so that people could specialize and trade and create wealth. They developed mathematics and astronomy so that the world could be understood and predicted. They wrote literature so that human experience could be captured and shared. All of this was new. All of this had to be invented from scratch. And the fact that we still use many of their inventions today, that we still divide our hours into 60 minutes, that we still have legal codes and cities and written literature, is a testament to their genius. The legacy of Sumer is everywhere. Once you start looking for it, it is in the alphabet we use, which ultimately derives from the cuneiform script they invented. It is in our number system, our mathematics, our astronomy. It is in the basic structure of our legal systems, the idea that laws should be written down and applied equally to everyone. It is in our cities, our governments, our schools. Every time you sign a contract, you are participating in a tradition that the Sumerians began. Every time you read a book, you are using a technology that they invented. Every time you look at a clock and see that an hour has 60 minutes, you are using a number system that they created. But perhaps their most important legacy is simply the example they set. They showed that civilization is possible, that human beings can work together to build something greater than themselves, something that will outlast any individual life. Before Sumer, human society was small-scale, temporary, constrained by the limits of memory and oral tradition. After Sumer, there was a new possibility, a new way of being human. People could live in cities, they could specialize in their work. They could accumulate knowledge across generations. They could build monuments that would stand for thousands of years. They could create art and literature that would speak to people they would never meet, who would live in times and places they could never imagine. This is what makes the story of Sumer so important. It is not just the story of one civilization among many. It is the story of the first civilization, the prototype, the model upon which all others would be based. When the Egyptians built their pyramids, when the Greeks built their temples, when the Romans built their roads and aqueducts, they were following a path that the Sumerians had first walked. And when those civilizations fell, when the Dark Ages came and cities were abandoned and literacy declined, it was the memory of what had been achieved, preserved in ancient texts and traditions, that inspired people to rebuild, to create new cities, new governments, new cultures. The cycle of rise and fall, of creation and destruction, that characterizes human history began with Sumer. But so did the enduring human drive to build, to create, to leave something behind that will outlast us. As you stand now in the ruins, as the sun sets over the desert and the shadows lengthen, you feel the weight of all this history. These mud bricks crumbling back into the earth were shaped by human hands 5,000 years ago. These walls enclosed spaces where people lived and worked and loved and died. These streets were walked by countless feet, by scribes and soldiers, by priests and merchants, by kings and slaves. All of them are gone now, dust and memory, but the things they built, the ideas they created, the knowledge they preserved, these things remain. They echo down through the centuries, shaping our world in ways both obvious and subtle, connecting us to a past that is distant and strange, and yet in fundamental ways familiar. The stars are coming out now, the same stars that the Sumerian priests watched thousands of years ago. They tracked the movements of these points of light with careful attention, recording their observations on clay tablets, building a body of astronomical knowledge that would be inherited by every civilization that came after. When you look up at the night sky here, in this ancient land, you are seeing what they saw. The constellations are the same. The planets follow the same paths. The moon waxes and wanes according to the same cycle. Time has passed. Empires have risen and fallen. Languages have been born and died, but the heavens remain constant, eternal, unchanged. There is something profoundly moving about this continuity, this connection across the vast gulf of time. The Sumerians looked at these same stars and saw gods. They saw the movements of Inanna, the evening star, the morning star, the goddess of love and war. They saw the stately progress of Marduk, Jupiter, the king of the gods. They saw omens and portents, messages from the divine realm about events in the human world. We look at the same stars and see planets, balls of rock and gas governed by the laws of physics, moving through space according to the principles of gravity and inertia. Our understanding is different, our interpretation is different, but the wonder remains. The same wonder that drove the Sumerian priests to stay up night after night, recording their observations, trying to find patterns in the movements of the heavens, trying to understand the universe in which they lived. And this, perhaps, is the deepest legacy of Sumer, the belief that the world can be understood, that patterns can be found, that knowledge can be accumulated and built upon. The Sumerians were not the first people to wonder about the world around them. That is a universal human trait, as old as consciousness itself. But they were the first to systematically record their observations, to create institutions dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge, to build a tradition of learning that would be passed down from teacher to student across generations. They created the first schools, the first libraries, the first scientific texts, and in doing so, they began the great human project of understanding the universe, a project that continues today, that drives our exploration of space, our research into the nature of matter and energy, our attempts to understand life and consciousness, and the fundamental laws that govern reality. The night deepens. The city around you is quiet now. The people asleep in their houses. The streets empty except for the occasional guard making his rounds. You find yourself drawn back to the ziggurat, climbing its stairs one last time in the darkness. The bricks are still warm from the day's heat, radiating stored energy into the cool night air. As you climb, the city spreads out below you, a pattern of shadows and faint lights, and then at the top you can see beyond the city walls, out across the fields and canals, to the river glinting in the starlight, to the distant horizon where earth and sky meet in a line that is barely visible in the darkness. This is where it all began. Here, in this flat, hostile, challenging land. Here, where there was no stone to build with, no wood for construction, no metal for tools. Here, where the rivers flooded unpredictably, where the heat was brutal, where survival required constant labor and constant vigilance. The Sumerians did not have any natural advantages. They were not blessed with abundant resources or a forgiving climate. What they had was ingenuity. They had the willingness to work together, to organize themselves, to solve problems collectively rather than individually. They had the foresight to plant crops and store surplus for lean times. They had the creativity to invent new tools, new techniques, new systems of organization, and they had the ambition to build something greater than any individual could achieve alone. This is the essence of civilization. It is not just cities and writing and laws, though those are important. It is the fundamental insight that human beings, working together, can accomplish things that would be impossible alone. A single person cannot dig a canal, but 100 people, organized and directed, can dig a canal in a season. A single person cannot build a ziggurat, but thousands of people, working over generations, can build a monument that will stand for millennia. A single person cannot develop a system of mathematics or astronomy, But a tradition of scholars, building on the work of their predecessors, can unlock the secrets of the universe. The Sumerians understood this. They built their entire civilization on this principle, and when their cities finally fell, when their language was forgotten, when the sands covered their temples, and the rivers changed course and left their canals dry, the principle remained. It was inherited by the Babylonians and the Assyrians, by the Persians and the Greeks, by the Romans and the Arabs, by the medieval Europeans and the modern world. Every civilization that has come after has built on the foundation that Sumer laid. We are all the children of Sumer, whether we know it or not. The wind picks up, blowing across the top of the ziggurat, carrying the scent of the desert and the river. You close your eyes and listen. There are no sounds now except the wind and the faint murmur of water in the distant canals. And in this silence, you can almost hear the voices of the past, the chant of priests in the temple below, the call of merchants in the marketplace, the laughter of children playing in the streets, the rhythmic strike of hammers in the workshops, the patient scratch of styluses on clay tablets. These voices are gone, but they are not entirely lost. They echo in the words we use, in the systems we have inherited, in the very structure of our civilization. They echo in every contract we sign, every calculation we make, every story we tell, every law we follow. The Sumerians are gone, but they left us a world transformed, a world where civilization is possible, where human potential can be realized, where knowledge can accumulate and grow across the generations. This was their gift. This was what they built in the desert between two rivers, 5,000 years ago. They built the foundation of everything that came after. They lit a fire that has never been extinguished, that burns still in every city, every library, every school, every court of law, every observatory, every place where human beings gather to learn and to build and to create something greater than themselves. This is the legacy of Sumer. This is why their story matters, not because they were perfect, they were not because their civilization lasted forever, it did not, but because they were first. They showed that it could be done. They proved that human beings could be more than scattered bands of hunters and gatherers, more than simple farmers living in villages. They showed that we could build cities, create knowledge, preserve memory, shape the world according to our will. And so, as the night deepens and the stars wheel overhead in their eternal dance, as the ancient city sleeps below and the rivers flow onward toward the sea, you feel a deep sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the ingenuity and courage of those long-dead people who dared to try something new, who worked and struggled and built despite overwhelming odds. Gratitude for the scribes who preserved their knowledge, who pressed their styluses into wet clay so that we could one day read their words. Gratitude for the archaeologists who dug through the sand and rubble to uncover the buried cities. Gratitude for the scholars who deciphered the ancient script and translated the tablets. And gratitude for the simple fact that we can know about the Sumerians at all, that we can learn from their example, that we can stand on the foundation they built and reach toward our own future. The journey through ancient Sumer is coming to an end. The night is peaceful, the air cool and still. You descend the ziggurat slowly, carefully, your hand on the rough brick for balance. When you reach the bottom, you turn and look back up at the massive structure, silhouetted against the stars. It has stood here for thousands of years, weathering storms and floods, conquests and collapses. It has outlasted the civilization that built it. It has outlasted 100 generations of human life, and it stands still, a testament to what human beings can achieve when they work together, when they dare to dream large, when they commit themselves to building something that will outlast their own brief existence. This is the final lesson of Sumer. Civilizations rise and fall. Empires come and go, languages are born and die, but the human drive to build, to create, to understand, to leave something behind. This is eternal. It is what makes us human. It is what connects us across the vast expanses of time and space, linking the scribes of ancient Uruk with the readers of today, the builders of the first cities with the architects of the modern world. We are all part of the same story, the same great human endeavor, and that story began here, in the land between two rivers, where a people with no natural advantages decided to try something new, to build something unprecedented, to create the first civilization. And now, as the stars fade and the eastern horizon begins to lighten with the approach of dawn, as the ancient world recedes and the present returns, you feel yourself being pulled back, drawn forward through the centuries, returning to your own time. The vision fades, The sounds of the ancient city grow distant. The smell of river water and baked earth, of smoke and incense, of barley and beer, all of this dissolves into memory. You open your eyes to find yourself back in the modern world, separated from ancient Sumer by 5,000 years and the vast gulf of forgetting and rediscovery. But you carry something with you now. You carry the knowledge of where we came from, of what our ancestors achieved, of the long, difficult, magnificent journey that brought us from those first mud brick cities to the complex, interconnected world we inhabit today. And so, our journey through ancient Sumer comes to an end. We have walked the streets of the first cities, watched the scribes invent writing, climbed the ziggurats to stand in the presence of the gods, seen the canal systems that turned desert into farmland, witnessed the birth of law and mathematics and literature. We have seen a civilization rise from nothing, flourish for thousands of years, and then slowly fade as new peoples and new cultures took its place. But we have also seen that what the Sumerians created did not truly die. It was transformed, absorbed, passed down to successor civilizations, eventually reaching us across the vast gulf of time. The story of Sumer is, in many ways, the story of humanity itself. It is a story of adaptation and innovation, of solving problems and overcoming challenges, of building and creating despite obstacles that seem insurmountable. The Sumerians faced a harsh environment, a land with few natural resources, a climate that alternated between devastating floods and brutal droughts. They had no blueprint to follow, no example to imitate. They were inventing civilization from scratch, figuring out as they went along how to organize large numbers of people, how to manage complex systems, how to preserve knowledge, how to maintain order and justice, and they succeeded. Against all odds, they built something magnificent, something that would change the course of human history forever. Their success was not accidental. It was the result of specific choices, specific innovations. They chose to settle in a difficult but fertile land. They chose to invest enormous labor in building and maintaining irrigation systems. They chose to create a system of writing to keep track of their increasingly complex economy. They chose to develop laws to resolve disputes peacefully. They chose to build temples and ziggurats, not just as places of worship but as centers of economic and political power. They chose to educate scribes, to preserve literature, to study the heavens, to accumulate knowledge across generations. Each of these choices required foresight, required sacrifice, required a willingness to work for a future that the individual would never see. And it is this ability to work for the future, to build for generations yet unborn, that distinguishes civilization from more basic forms of human society. We live today in a world that is vastly more complex, more technologically advanced, more globally interconnected than anything the Sumerians could have imagined. We have split the atom and walked on the moon. We have decoded the human genome and built computers that can process information at speeds that would seem like magic to ancient scribes. We can communicate instantaneously with people on the other side of the planet. We can preserve not just our words but our images, our voices, our movements, in formats that will last far longer than clay tablets. And yet, for all our advances, we still face the same fundamental challenges that the Sumerians faced. We still must organize ourselves, create laws, maintain justice, preserve knowledge, educate the next generation, and work together to solve problems that no individual can solve alone. The Sumerians did not have all the answers. Their society was far from perfect. It was hierarchical and often unjust. Slavery existed. Women had fewer rights than men in many contexts. Wars were common and brutal. The environment was exploited unsustainably, leading eventually to the decline of the civilization. But for all its flaws, Sumerian society represented an enormous leap forward in human potential. It showed that large-scale cooperation was possible, that knowledge could accumulate, that cities could be built and sustained, that human beings could shape their environment rather than simply adapting to it. And the fact that we can see the flaws in Sumerian society, that we can recognize where they went wrong, is itself a product of the tradition of critical thinking and moral reflection that they helped to begin. The clay tablets that have survived from ancient Sumer are now housed in museums and university collections around the world. They are being digitized, made available online so that scholars anywhere can study them. New translations are being published. New insights are being gained, and these tablets continue to speak to us across the millennia. They tell us about the price of barley in Ur in 2100 BCE, about a legal dispute between neighbors, about the love of a king for his wife, about the fear of death and the hope for some kind of immortality. They tell us that the people of ancient Sumer were human in every sense that we are human. They worried and hoped, loved and hated, struggled and succeeded. They were our ancestors, not in a genetic sense necessarily, but in a cultural and intellectual sense. We are the inheritors of what they built. When we look at the ruins of Uruk and Ur, when we see the remains of the great ziggurats rising from the desert sand, we are looking at the birthplace of our own civilization, not just Western civilization or Near Eastern civilization, but human civilization in its broadest sense. The innovations of Sumer spread outward, carried by trade and conquest, imitated and adapted by other peoples. The Egyptians developed their own writing system, but the idea of writing, the concept that language could be visually represented and preserved, likely came from Mesopotamia. The Indus Valley civilization had its own script and its own urban culture, but it too may have been influenced by Mesopotamian examples. The Chinese developed their own unique writing system independently, but the same fundamental insight was at work: the need to record information, to preserve knowledge, to communicate across time and space. And as these early civilizations grew and interacted, as trade routes expanded and empires rose and fell, the innovations of Sumer spread further and further, eventually reaching every corner of the globe. The Phoenicians adapted cuneiform into an alphabetic script, which the Greeks adopted and modified, which the Romans spread throughout their empire, which evolved into the alphabet you are reading right now. The mathematical systems developed by Sumerian scribes were refined by Babylonian astronomers, transmitted to Greek scholars, preserved by Arab mathematicians, and eventually incorporated into the mathematical frameworks that underlie modern science and technology. The legal concepts first codified in Sumer influenced the law codes of Babylon and Assyria, which influenced Hebrew law, which influenced Greek and Roman law, which form the foundation of legal systems around the world today. This is how civilization works. It is not created by isolated geniuses working alone. It is built collectively, across generations, with each generation inheriting the accumulated knowledge and achievements of those who came before, adding their own contributions, and passing the whole package on to those who come after. The Sumerians began this process. They were the first to systematically record knowledge, to build institutions dedicated to preserving and transmitting it, to create a cultural continuity that could survive beyond the lifespan of any individual or even any single generation. And in doing so, they set in motion a process that has continued for 5,000 years and continues still today. As you sit here now in the quiet of the night, letting these thoughts settle, you might reflect on your own place in this long chain of inheritance. Everything you know, everything you can do is built on foundations laid by countless people who came before you. The language you speak evolved over thousands of years. The alphabet you use was invented and refined across multiple civilizations. The mathematical concepts you learned in school were developed over millennia by scholars in many different cultures. The scientific method, the legal system, the political institutions, the technological innovations that shape your daily life, all of these have long, complex histories that stretch back, ultimately, to those first experiments in civilization that took place in ancient Sumer. This is not to say that the Sumerians invented everything, or that later civilizations merely copied what they did. Far from it. Each civilization that came after made its own unique contributions, developed its own innovations, solved problems in its own ways. But the fundamental framework, the basic idea that large-scale human cooperation is possible, that knowledge can be preserved and built upon, that cities and laws and writing and schools can exist, this framework was established in Sumer. And once it was established, once it was proven to be possible, it became a template that could be adapted and modified and improved upon, but never completely abandoned. The night is very deep now, and the world is quiet. Your breathing has slowed. Your body relaxed. The journey through ancient Sumer has taken you far from the present, deep into a past that is both alien and familiar. You have seen the birth of cities, the invention of writing, the creation of law and mathematics and literature. You have walked among people who have been dust for 5,000 years, but whose voices still echo in the clay tablets they left behind. You have climbed ziggurats and stood in temples, watched scribes at their work and soldiers at their training, eaten barley bread and drunk beer, felt the heat of the Mesopotamian sun and the cool of the evening breeze. You have witnessed the first great experiment in human civilization, and you have seen both its triumphs and its failures. And now, as this journey ends, as the vision of ancient Sumer fades and the present returns, you carry with you something valuable. You carry an understanding of where we came from, of the long and difficult path that humanity has traveled, of the countless generations who worked and struggled and built so that we could be here now. You carry a sense of connection to the deep past, a recognition that we are not separate from history but part of it, that we stand on the shoulders of giants, that everything we have and everything we are is the product of this long chain of inheritance and innovation. And perhaps you carry too a sense of responsibility, an awareness that just as we are the beneficiaries of what previous generations built, so too will future generations depend on what we build, on what we preserve, on what we pass on. The Sumerians could not have imagined us, could not have foreseen the world we live in, with its machines and technologies that would seem like miracles to them, but they would recognize, I think, the fundamental challenges we face. They too struggled to organize large societies, to maintain justice, to preserve knowledge, to live sustainably in a challenging environment. They too made mistakes, caused harm, fell short of their ideals, but they tried, they built, they created, they left us a world transformed. And that, in the end, is all any generation can do, to take what we have been given, to add what we can, to preserve what is valuable, and to pass it on to those who come after, trusting that they will do the same. The story of Sumer is over. The cities are ruins. The language is dead, the people are gone, but the legacy remains. It remains in every city we build, every word we write, every law we follow, every calculation we make, every story we tell. It remains in the very structure of our civilization, in the deep foundations that were laid 5,000 years ago in the land between two rivers. And it remains in us, in our minds and hearts, in our capacity for cooperation and innovation, in our drive to understand and to build and to create. We are all the children of Sumer, the inheritors of that first great leap forward in human history. And knowing this, understanding where we came from and what was sacrificed to bring us here, we can perhaps move forward with greater wisdom, greater appreciation, greater determination to build well and to preserve what is valuable for those who will come after us. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the deep past. Thank you for opening your mind to the story of these ancient people, for allowing their voices to speak to you across the millennia. The story of Sumer is not just their story, it is our story too. It is the beginning of the story we are still living, still writing, still creating. And so as you drift towards sleep, as consciousness fades and dreams begin, carry with you the knowledge of what has been achieved, of what is possible, of the long chain of human effort and ingenuity that connects the first mud brick cities of ancient Mesopotamia to the world you inhabit today. Rest well knowing that you are part of something greater than yourself, part of a story that began 5,000 years ago and continues still. Sleep peacefully and dream of distant ages, of the first cities rising from the desert, of the first words being pressed into clay, of the beginning of everything we know. Until next time, good night, and may your rest be deep and peaceful.